Hello, everyone. So for this chapter, chapter 6 is going to be one video, and it's going to cover all of cellular respiration. I have decided to shorten chapters 6 and 7 and not make them so long. I would rather for you guys to learn more about the overall concepts rather than all the details that can bog down these chapters. And so let's first learn about cellular respiration and how cells harvest chemical energy. Um, so as an introduction, oxygen is a reactant in cellular respiration. It's needed to start the process. It helps break down sugar and other food molecules and generates ATP, and which is the energy currency used in cells, and it releases heat. Um, So in this chapter, we're going to look at the different stages of cellular respiration and how cells produce ATP in the presence of oxygen, and also what happens if oxygen is not present. So first of all, cellular respiration is an aerobic harvesting of energy. And I always learned that aerobic just means that it needs oxygen. Oxygen is required for this process. So photosynthesis and cellular respiration provide the energy for life. So life requires energy. In almost all ecosystems, energy ultimately comes from the sun, from photosynthesis. So, but we're going to cover photosynthesis next. For this chapter, it's just on cellular respiration. But the two, photosynthesis and cellular respiration, go hand in hand. In photosynthesis, the energy of sunlight is used to rearrange the atoms of carbon dioxide and water into organic molecules, sugar molecules, and then photosynthesis releases oxygen. In cellular respiration, though, oxygen is consumed as organic molecules are broken down back into carbon and high water molecules. So the cell then captures the energy that is released from this breaking down of the organic molecules as ATP. So here's just an overall diagram showing you how photosynthesis and cellular respiration are related to each other. They are complementary processes. Respiration, often used as a synonym for breathing, refers to an exchange of gases. So us as organisms, we obtain oxygen from the air, from the environment, and we breathe out carbon dioxide as a waste product. Breathing and cellular respiration are closely related. Um, Cellular respiration occurs on the cellular level, but the reason why we breathing, is to exchange the gases that are produced and needed for cellular respiration. So once again, those two processes are very closely related. And this is just showing you how when we breathe, we take in oxygen and give off carbon dioxide. And that oxygen is what's needed for our cells to do cellular respiration, which is why we have a vascular system that transports oxygenated blood to all of the parts of our body. And then that carbon dioxide, that waste product, is also transported back in the blood to the lungs to be released out of the body. Carbon dioxide is a waste product, and so we do not need that in our bodies. So cellular respiration is an exergonic, which means energy releasing process that transfers energy from glucose to form ATP, and it captures about 34% of the available energy originally stored in glucose. The rest of the energy is lost as heat. So around 66% of the energy stored in glucose is lost as heat. There is a reason why your bodies are 98.6 degrees. So here is the overall equation or chemical formula of cellular respiration. It requires an energy source or a chemical energy source in the form of glucose and oxygen. Those two are required. And during cellular respiration, they are broken down and carbon dioxide is released, water molecules are released. But the cells are able to obtain ATP. That is the energy molecule used in our cells. And then, of course, as I stated a while ago, 64% of that energy is lost as heat. So your body requires a continuous supply of energy. Each cell in your body requires energy. And that's what cellular respiration is for. So you have to have a balance of energy intake and expenditure to maintain a healthy weight and also to maintain homeostasis. If you don't have a healthy intake or a healthy balance of energy, then that will have a detrimental effect on your body as a whole. However, most Americans are fortunate in that we have an abundance of food, which means we have an abundance of energy. And so that if we're not actively exercising, many times we can end up becoming overweight, which most Americans are considered obese or overweight. And so it's important to stay active and to have a balanced diet. This is to maintain a healthy lifestyle. And so this diagram is just showing you the different types of activities and the amounts of calories that are burned or consumed in an hour of these exercises or activities, with running being the most consumptive one at 978, around 9 calories per hour of activity. So cells capture energy from electrons that are falling from organic fuels to oxygen. And so hopefully I can explain oxidation and reduction. They can be very confusing, in my opinion, very confusing concepts. So how do your cells extract energy from fuel molecules? It involves the transfer of electrons in chemical reactions. Remember, energy is stored in the bonds of molecules. When you break those bonds or you transfer energy, it comes from the breaking or combining of the atoms in a molecule. Electrons removed from fuel molecules is called oxidation. And they are transferred to another energy molecule called NAD+, and that is called reduction. So when you gain or lose electrons, it's either oxidation or reduction. If you remove electrons or lose electrons, you are oxidated. If you gain electrons, you are reduced. It's reduction. And which kind of sounds backwards, but it has to do with the fact that electrons are negatively charged. So if you are to gain a negatively charged electron, so you're gaining a negative, you're being reduced. And if you lose something that's negative, then you're being oxidized, which is oxidation. The energy molecule NADH passes electrons to the electron transport chain. And the electrons will fall or be passed along from one carrier to the next, where finally oxygen gas is released. Another way I like to think of it is that those electrons, they have energy and they're hot. And so I always imagine it's like a game of hot potato, in that each molecule is not able to hold on to that energy for so long, and they have to pass it along to someone else, to another protein carrier, to hold that energy. And so they have to keep passing along the electron, or the hot potato. So this is the equation for cellular respiration again, but now the molecules are labeled as either being oxidized or being reduced. So if you'll notice here, if you go from having hydrogen molecules like glucose to losing those hydrogen molecules, which will become carbon dioxide, that's becoming oxidized, because hydrogen is, those electrons are negative, straight negative electrons. The oxygen gas, it gains hydrogen and becomes water molecules, which means it's become reduced. It's gained the electrons from hydrogen, which are straight negative as well. So this image, I don't really like this image that much. But basically, this is just to show you guys that the energy molecule NADH that is created will drop off its electrons in the electron transport chain. So this is showing you that the two electrons are dropped off, and they're passed along from one protein carrier to the next. This is the falling of the electrons, as was mentioned earlier. And this process here, this what I call the hot potato process, they're passing these electrons from one to the next, and it creates ATP. It's a series of chemical reactions that will create ATP. And then that electron will end up in a water molecule. So let's go through the stages of cellular respiration. That was just an overview of cellular respiration and how it was an aerobic process. There are three main stages of cellular respiration. The first stage is glycolysis. It occurs in the cytosol. It begins cellular respiration, and it's the first step to break down glucose into two molecules of a 3-carbon compound called pyruvate. Glycolysis is universal. It occurs in all living cells. Stage 2 is called pyruvate oxidation and the citric acid cycle. These take place in the mitochondria. It completes the breakdown of glucose into carbon dioxide, and in the third stage of cellular respiration with electrons is oxidative phosphorylation, which involves the electron transport and chemiosmosis. And while a lot of these terms may be new to you guys, I'm going to go through and show you each one in the diagrams, what these are. So in stage 3, NADH, which is the energy molecule, and then another energy molecule, FADH2, will take electrons to the electron transport chain in the inner folds of the mitochondrial membrane. Most of the ATP produced by cellular respiration is generated here in this third stage of oxidative phosphorylation. And then finally, those electrons, once they've been passed from electron carrier to electron carrier, they will finally be passed to oxygen and become part of a reduced water molecule. So this is an overview of cellular respiration, which shows you all three steps of the process and what they create in each process. So stage one, glycolysis here, occurs in the cytosol or in the fluid of the cell. It doesn't actually occur in the mitochondria. Glycolysis will create some ATP. Though it's very limited, it does produce some ATP. The goal of glycolysis is to break down glucose into pyruvate. Pyruvate is small enough now to be able to travel into the mitochondria where it can undergo oxidation and then enter into the citric acid cycle. The citric acid cycle is where carbon dioxide is created, which is created as a waste product. Carbon dioxide is a waste product in cellular respiration. However, the citric acid cycle will create some ATP, but it also creates NADH and FADH2, which is going to be sent to the electron transport chain or oxidative phosphorylation. And so it's the electron transport chain here that will use these molecules and create the majority of the ATP that is created in cellular respiration. And then finally, those electrons will be given to oxygen, where they will create water molecules, which is a waste product in cellular respiration. So let's go through each stage in more detail. Glycolysis is the first stage, and it harvests chemical energy by oxidizing glucose into pyruvate. So we're going to break down glucose into two smaller molecules called pyruvate. ATP is used to prime glucose, which just means that ATP is used to split that in sugar molecule. Glucose is a big sugar molecule, so we have to break it apart. And then those the series of chemical reactions that what your book here calls intermediates will be formed. But the end result is you're going to create two molecules of pyruvate, yielding a net total of 2 ATP and 2 NADPH molecules. Now, these are energy molecules. ATP is the energy molecule that can be used, readily used. It can be used immediately. NADPH, though, cannot be used immediately. It is just a carrier. It's carrying energy in the bonds of NADPH. That NADPH has to then be traveled or sent to the electron transport chain, which we'll get to in stage 3. So ATP is formed by what we call substrate level phosphorylation, which means that a phosphate group is transferred from an organic molecule to ADP. And so this is just showing you the overall results of glycolysis. You have your glucose molecule, which is 6 carbons. And through a series of chemical reactions where ADP is going to gain some phosphorus from the chemical reactions, in which will create ATP. And then NAD plus will gain some hydrogens and create NADH. So you're going from 6 carbon glucose to 2 3 carbon pyruvates. This is just an image showing you substrate level phosphorylation, which just means that An enzyme is going to bind to a substrate molecule, an organic molecule, and take this phosphorus off and add it to ADP. When you add it to ADP, you're creating a 3-phosphorus molecule called ATP. So this is substrate level phosphorylation. Literally just taking phosphate off of this organic molecule and adding it to ADP to create ATP. There are multiple reactions in glycolysis. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, these are the steps. Multiple reactions, and we're just going to simplify. We're not going to give these names. I just want you guys to know that this occurs. That glycolysis is actually a very long, detailed process, and a lot of reactants and products will be made called intermediates. And then there are these steps that will consume energy, but then there are steps that will yield energy. So this is the energy investment in glycolysis. So once again, you do not have to know the steps. I just want you to know that this exists, where you have a glucose molecule where energy is required, used. So ATP here is dropping off energy and becoming ADP. So dropping off its phosphate, and it's going to help split and break apart this glucose molecule into 2 separate 3-carbon intermediates. So then once that occurs, then you'll have your energy payoff, where it took energy here to break apart the glucose molecule, and then the payoff is after another series of chemical reactions, it will start to create energy. So you have your reduction phase where you will drop off some hydrogens. So hydrogens will be dropped off and create NADH, which will be used later. And then it will remove these phosphorus that were added on. So they will be added and you'll create more ATP. And then after another series of chemical reactions, we've created some water molecules here, that this other phosphorus will have to come off, creating more ATP until finally you get just 2 pyruvate molecules. And so that concludes glycolysis. And so, like I said, I want you guys to know the overall goal, the overall point of glycolysis is that you break down glucose into 2 molecules of pyruvate, and you do create some ATP and NADH, which can be used later. Every living cell uses and can do glycolysis. Every living cell on the planet, every prokaryotic cell, eukaryotic cell, they can all do glycolysis. It does not require mitochondria. It happens inside the cytosol. So that takes us to stage 2, which is the citric acid cycle and pyruvate oxidation. So pyruvate, which was created in glycolysis, has to be prepped to enter into the mitochondria and then prepped to be used in the citric acid cycle. So once pyruvate becomes oxidated, you will create acetyl-CoA. For each turn of the citric acid cycle, 2 carbons from acetyl-CoA are added, 2 CO2 molecules are released as waste products, and 3 NADH and 1 FADH2 molecules are produced as energy carriers to be used later in the electron transport chain. So here is just an overview of the first is pyruvate oxidation, and then there is the citric acid cycle. So let's talk about pyruvate oxidation. So pyruvate, the 3-carbon molecule here, will enter into the mitochondria, and a series of chemical reactions will occur. You'll remove a carbon dioxide. NAD plus will gain a hydrogen, become an energy carrier molecule. And then the coenzyme A will bind to the 2 carbons that were left over and now create a molecule called acetyl-CoA. And this acetyl-CoA is what's going to be used in the citric acid cycle. So here's the citric acid cycle. Let me see. Yeah. So this is just an overview of the cycle. I'm going to go through each step of the cycle in more detail. There are 6 major steps of the citric acid cycle. Step 1, the 2 carbon molecules with coenzyme A, acetyl-CoA, will drop off the 2 carbons to enter into the cycle. So coenzyme A will break off, will drop these 2 carbons off, and these 2 carbons here will bind with the 4-carbon molecule oxaloacetate. So these 2 will bind and create a citrate or a 6-carbon molecule. Now you guys do not have to know all the names of these carbon molecules, but the numbers of carbon though are important. So you drop off 2 carbons and it binds with a 4-carbon molecule to create a 6-carbon molecule. And then you have a series of chemical reactions where NAD plus will gain a hydrogen, and it will go as it will be an electron energy carrier molecule. You'll drop off carbon dioxide as a waste product. Some more chemical reactions occur. Drop off more carbon dioxide. This is a waste product. You gain another hydrogen here from NAD plus, and it will become an energy carrier. And then some ATP will be created here as well. So what I want you to know or understand is that this is just a series of chemical reactions where you're adding or taking away things, and you're gaining energy or you're getting rid of waste products on each step of the process. And then the last part of the cycle here is basically, so you've created ATP, and you want to now reorganize or recreate or recycle, whatever term you want to use here, the oxaloacetate, the 4-carbon molecule here that will be able to bind with another 2-carbon molecule from acetyl-CoA that gets dropped off into the cycle. So another series of chemical reactions occurs here where you create now some FADH2, water molecules are used, and then you drop off another hydrogen here. And so this is the citric acid cycle. It's just a series of chemical reactions that create energy carrier molecules, or ATP, or CO2 as a waste product. The overall goal, the overall point that I want you guys to get from the citric acid cycle is that energy molecules are created, Carbon dioxide is created as a waste product. And as each series of chemical reactions occur, everything is then recycled back so that it can be used again. And this process can be repeated and recycled with no problem. So this leads us to the third stage of cellular respiration, where most ATP production is going to be created by oxidative phosphorylation or through the electron transport chain. So those energy carrying molecules, NADH and FADH2, which was created most are created during the citric acid cycle. Some are created in glycolysis, will be sent to be used in the electron transport chain. So the energy from these molecules will be used to fuel the chemical reactions to move hydrogen ion across the intermembrane space. And then finally, in a process called chemiosmosis, it's where a hydrogen gradient creates a flow, a diffusion from, remember, when you have high concentrations of a substance, it will flow from a high concentration to low concentration. And this occurs in the very, very large enzyme called ATP synthase, where most of the ATP is created in cellular respiration. This here is the overall diagram of the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. And yeah, so this is in the folds of the mitochondria. So you have your molecules here of your proteins in the phospholipid, this bilayer in the mitochondria. And so you have NADH and FADH2, and these were from the citric acid cycle or the glycolysis. They're going to come and they're going to drop off. So NADH here is going to drop off its electrons. Okay, once it drops off those electrons, it becomes NAD+. So this will go back to the other parts, the other stages. But those electrons are dropped off. As you drop off those electrons, it creates a chemical reaction where the hydrogen ion here will flow to the other side. And so as NADH and FADH2 drops off their electrons, a whole series of reactions will occur as they are passed along from one protein to the next. They will cause the hydrogen ions to flow across the membrane. And so this is just a continuous process. The hydrogen ions will flow across the membrane. At the end of the chain, the electron transport chain, these electrons now have lost their energy. And so they are no longer useful to fuel these energy reactions, so they will be picked up by an oxygen molecule to create water. And so this water molecule is now a byproduct or waste product from cellular respiration. The overall result of the electron transport chain, though, is this concentration gradient now. So you have put all these hydrogen ions on this side. They have all traveled here. So now you have a very, very high concentration of hydrogen ions on this side and low concentration on this side. And so that leads us to the last part of the oxidative phosphorylation is the chemiosmosis. This huge structure here is called ATP synthase. So when you have a high concentration of hydrogen ions on this side, they will naturally flow through this big protein. And I always like to say that it's like a water wheel. So the hydrogen ion will act like water as it's traveling through a water wheel, and it will turn this protein. And as it turns this protein and it comes back out the other side, it's going to turn it and it's going to cause it to create ATP by binding ADP and phosphorus. And so ATP will be created. It is in chemiosmosis where the majority of ATP is created in the cells. It is this process right here, the simple flowing of hydrogen ions from one side, from a higher concentration to a lower concentration, that it creates most of the energy that is created in cellular respiration. So let's review. So overall, each glucose molecule that you started with in glycolysis will end up producing around 32 ATP molecules. Sometimes that number can be a little higher. If you look in different books, it can go up to 38. Sometimes it can be lower than 32, but the average is around ATP, 32 ATP. And this is just a review showing you the total ATP production produced by each step of the process, where in the last step of chemiosmosis, around 28 ATP are produced, producing around 32 ATP total. And so what I love about this slide is that it also shows you the amount of the energy carrying molecules here, how many that are created from each step of the process. So that concludes cellular respiration as an aerobic process. But what happens when oxygen is not available? That is what we call fermentation, which is an anaerobic, which means without oxygen energy production. So fermentation is a way of harvesting energy that does not require oxygen. It happens under anaerobic conditions, which means it happens when there is no oxygen available. This can happen in your muscle cells, yeast, certain bacteria can produce ATP, usually only by glycolysis. NAD plus is recycled from NADH as pyruvate is reduced to either lactate or alcohol and CO2. So there are two different forms of fermentation. There's lactic acid fermentation or alcohol fermentation. And I'm pretty sure we all know about alcohol fermentation. Because of that, we are able to produce our wines and beers. So in lactic acid fermentation, there's no oxygen available. NADH is produced and used again in the same glycolysis. It's not being sent to anywhere else. And so instead of producing 2 pyruvate, 2 lactate are produced. Same thing for alcohol fermentation. The NADH is used when no oxygen is available to convert the pyruvate into ethanol, which can be used by the cell. This is just a picture of wine production. So the question is, how does this relate to humans? So lactic acid fermentation occurs in our muscle cells. You ever wonder why when you work out or you're running or you do any physical activity and your muscles hurt? You're sore. Well, that's because your muscles have used all of the oxygen that is available to them, and they start to produce lactate. So they undergo lactic acid fermentation. That lactate builds up in your muscle cells and it causes them to hurt. That is where the actual soreness comes from in your body. Then you have alcohol fermentation, and so we as humans have used this process to create wine. You put all the ingredients that are needed in, say, those barrels there, and then you seal them. When you seal them, they're not exposed to oxygen anymore. There's no more oxygen. And so the only thing they can do is undergo alcohol fermentation. The yeast undergoes alcohol fermentation. So this is just a factoid in us thinking about the evolution and history of our cells. Glycolysis occurs in the cytosol, not in the mitochondria. And it occurs in all living cells that, well, at least we have discovered so far. Every cell, every living organism can undergo glycolysis. So that must mean, and the evidence points, that is to be the universal or nearly original process to occur or to have evolved in the ancient prokaryotes that first originated on the planet. So it's one of the oldest chemical processes that were able to evolve and adapt. So let's talk about some connections between metabolic pathways. Cells use all kinds of organic molecules for fuel. In cellular respiration, you obtain most of your calories from carbohydrates, which are sugars, from fats and proteins. And so your body is able to break all of these down, and your cells are able to use all three macromolecules in the process of cellular respiration. And so this is just showing you that it doesn't matter if it's a carbohydrate, a fat, or a protein. They can all be broken down and used in the different stages of cellular respiration. And if you'll notice here, carbs, fats, and proteins can all be used in glycolysis. So this is why I mentioned earlier, you may see different amounts of ATP produced. That's because it depends on the kind of organic molecule is being used. If it's a carbohydrate, glucose, it will be, which is the most common, the one that's used the most, create probably the most amounts of ATP, where fats and proteins will have to be changed chemically to be used in glycolysis, and then in the other parts of the cycle. And that concludes cellular respiration. For the next chapter, we're going to be looking at photosynthesis and how that relates to cellular respiration itself too.